well, what could be the structure, we thought about three different ways of approaching the webinar week. The first day we had two keynote speakers. We had also Steve Wheeler, that is with us today too, and Wibi Dijkstra explaining more in depth what blended learning is or is understood from different perspectives. On the second day, we had four different practices, good practices in blended learning in distance education and also in face-to-face universities, how they are approaching this. And today the thing is to discuss with three splendid and experts in blended learning and innovation in distance education and online education, talking about the present and future of blended learning. So here we are, here they are. You can, well, see that we will have Stefan Polmans from Leuven, Steve Wheeler from Plymouth University, and Antonio Moreira Teixeira, Universidade Aberta de Portugal. Three different countries, three different experts with great experience and keynote speakers. And well, Antonio, for instance, had been the president of Eden as well. So with, well, a lot of experience. And what I thought is, well, let's pose some questions all along the time we have available. And they are going to answer as they want, I mean, as they prefer. Maybe they want to answer one question and not on another one, or maybe they want to intervene with all the questions, so such as they prefer, and they will have the floor and they will discuss about these topics. So the first is about the conceptualization of blended learning, and these are the two questions I will pose to them. First, there are many different conceptions of blended learning, and the thing is there any you prefer most and why? And the link to that is, do you think we can talk about different blended learning approaches regarding traditional face-to-face universities and open and distant ones? So the floor is yours, and I will intervene after that to present the rest of the questions.
Yeah,
well,
go ahead.
yes, go for it. So, Stefan.
So I am. Ooh, there's a lot of echo now. So I am participating in the embed project. Do you also hear that sound? I don't know how I can.
We have a lot of echo now. I don't know why.
Yeah.
Because
we tested before, it went well.
Now it works well. It seems. Try again, Stefan.
Okay, I will try again. So I am participating in the embed project together with Wiebe on Tuesday, Wiebe Dijkstra, and also colleagues from 5 other universities.
Please, Steve or Antonio, go ahead, and we hope, hopefully, it will work afterwards.
Okay.
Steve?
Shall I say something then? This is an interesting question, because as you've mentioned in the question itself, there are many different ways of expressing blended learning, many different mixes, if you will. And the one I prefer the most is the student-driven one, the one that is chosen by the students themselves, because after all, who is doing the learning? It's the student, and the student is probably your customer, because in these days they pay tuition fees and they spend a lot of time and a lot of effort and a lot of their resources trying to become educated. And I think that for us as educators, professional teachers in universities, we have to consider the students' needs first. And I think that of all the forms of blended learning that are available, I think that the student should probably need to choose. And I think we need to support that. I gave a story not so long back about an architect who had designed a university campus. And the interesting thing was he hadn't put any pathways in when the buildings were built. And they said, well, you know, the students and the staff are arriving soon. Where are the pathways? He said, I'm going to wait. And so they let him wait, and the paths were made by the students. The students and the staff came and they walked across the grass and they made these pathways. And then he came in with his builders and paved them over. And that's a wonderful metaphor, I think, for the idea of not necessarily dictating to students that this is the way you must learn, or providing them with the systems, but having the systems available, ready to support them in any direction they wish to choose. And that might be, rather radical to say that, but I think that today we must look at personalized and personal learning as the most important aspects of higher education. And I rest my case.
Well, I'll pick up from Steve now. I would, going directly to the question as it was in the way it was asked. I would call on the reference of Tony Bates. I think he has given us a clear understanding of this discussion. And when he puts the focus not on the quantity of what is actually contributing to this blended approach, but the quality of the experience itself. And this connects a little bit what Steve was saying as well. So the first point I would make is that when we're talking about the blended learning approach, my preference it goes to what we would call the hybrid approach. So in which the learning activities, in a sense, are conducted both on a physical environment and also an online environment. It's not just, for instance, recording a lecture and having the students seeing it through on a platform and then having the classroom to discuss about it. It's not just that. It's something in which you have activities or part of the activities which are designed and conducted in an online environment and others in a physical environment. And this is part of a global design that intends to take the best out of each approach. So in that sense, the element of the quality of what we're doing actually is important. And this, of course, differentiates a lot the experiences that we can already detect. And this will, of course, lead us to the second question. But I would probably focus on this element of the quality of the experience and the hybrid approach more than just blending different tools in the experience.
Again?
Again, try.
No, so we when we started the Embed Endeavor project, we had during the first kickoff meeting we had a thorough discussion, the definition of blended learning, and well, I agree with Steve and Antonio. I would like to add two, let's say, feature or aspects to the definition of blended learning, and one of them is it should be the choice of online and offline learning activities should be deliberate. So it's not just, let's say, a mixture of activities depending on the technology that is available in your institution, but you should have a good reason why you want to choose an online activity or a face-to-face or offline activity. And so we also oppose let's say, a time-based or percentage-based approach to define blended learning. Like if you have so many online activities, then you're blended. If you have only a few, you're not really blended. So that's what we oppose. Another keyword I would like to emphasize is the integration of online, offline, or on campus, off campus. There should be an interdependency. So I would even say that your contact hours, your face-to-face time with your students as a teacher or lecturer should be adjusted to what you have done online. Like I can flip in the classroom where your students prepare a lecture, and as a lecturer you adapt your classroom time. You should take advantage of of what you see online. And in our institution, we often see that this is not the case. So there are many lecturers who say, I am doing a blended approach. But then what they do is they just add extra material, or they just duplicate what they see in class and they put it online, like a recorded lecture. And for us, this is not really integration. So that's for us the key in defining blended learning. It should be with a purpose, deliberate, learning objectives, of course, and so there should be integration. And so then you can have a kind of what we'd already called a blended learning wave, kind of a string of activities that can either be online, offline, but that are interconnected. That's how we define blended learning.
Okay, so we have the blended learning might be a personalized student's journey. That is quite an interesting focus on what we should do with technology now. A hybrid approach, not offline and physical, and also that it requires a good off-campus and on-campus integration. So moving towards the next questions would be looking towards evolution in future. Is blended learning experimenting a clear evolution in this century compared to the blended learning we had in the last century, in the 20th? Do you think it can be the best way to give solutions facing 21st century educational challenges? And which technologies do you think are the ones that may support better blended learning options in the near future? Let's ask these two questions together.
Well, I can start by approaching them and also trying to to answer the second question in the first slide, which you actually missed in a way. So the second question was, is there a different approach from distance education universities or conventional universities regarding blended learning? And I would say that it does not depend only on the pedagogical culture that each type of university has, but also on the quality of the learning design that is implemented. So in this sense, it's not just a difference between distance education universities or distance learning universities and conventional universities. Is about good design and good well-designed experiences and ones which are just blending different tools with no criteria and not following a proper design as well. But of course, this also represents that there is a different starting point. Of course, distance learning universities operate on a fully online mode, and this, of course, the blended approach is a complement, in a sense, an extension of that experience in order to have a more a better outreach in terms of the quality of the educational experience. And of course, from the conventional university's point of view, is exactly the reverse. So this also is important to take into consideration. Regarding the questions 3 and 4, of course, there is a difference, and the difference, for instance, in my view, historically, has to do also with the impact of the MOOC movement. This is something that we didn't have in the 20th century, this notion of the importance of well, a connectivist approach in a sense, but also the elements of scale, the combination of scale with personalization. Well, these are things that are typical of our current scenario and were not in the picture some 20 years ago. Regarding, and of course, we are now directing, and Steve will certainly have a lot to say about this, and we're now directing a profile of competencies, a notion of digital literacy that we didn't have in the 20th century. And of course, but I'll leave that to Steve to explore. Regarding the fourth question, which technologies do you think are the ones who may support better blended learning? Well, I don't think this should be a closed question. It will depend. As Steve was saying, it will depend a lot on the what can contribute to this focus on the personalization element, on also what would be the digital learning scenarios that would better facilitate a deeper learning approach. And this is something that we have to consider as well. It's not just which technologies, but what digital learning scenario can be designed using the available technologies. I would probably rephrase the question in this sense. But I'll leave now to Steve and Stefan to elaborate on this.
Well, shall I pick up on that, along with what Stefan said earlier on? I agree very much that blended learning, in whatever format you're going to present learning opportunities, has to be deliberate. It has to be planned in the sense of the need for it to be taken up. So let's take the fourth question here. Let's take the word support. I think the support word is the most important word in there, because students, when they are studying at a distance from a parent university, they need a lot of support. In fact, they probably need more support than students who are being taught on a face-to-face basis. So when they are removed from the university by distance, whether it's by time or by geographical distance, they need a lot of support. Now, Patricia Cornwell, who in 2000 talked about 3 types of important support. The first is academic, the second is technical, and the third is social. Now, in my experience, the first one is the most important one for teachers to be able to support students with. The other 2, technical and emotional or social, are often provided by the students themselves, I find. That's almost always the case. But the first one, academic, is the really important one that will help them to succeed in terms of their learning outcomes. And I think that what we need to do in terms of what Stefan said earlier on about selecting the right technologies and being deliberate about our planning, and what Antonius just said about the design issues, the design of the way that the learning is offered, you know, the actual offering of the delivery of the program, then we need to select the best possible technologies to support that academic learning. And from my own research, in fact, my thesis was based upon the idea of affordances of different technologies. And, you know, J.J. Gibson, the psychologist from the 60s, J.J. Gibson's work on top-down perception of technology. Every technology has built-in design features that support different things and constrain other things as well. And I think we need a better understanding of the affordances of technologies when we're looking at different blended approaches. And I'll leave it at that point, because probably others want to come back on that a little bit more.
We looked at the literature and we found some, let's say, studies that help lecturers select the right tools, flowchart based even. That's a study of Hirumi, for instance. There are others who have made a kind of classification, like which type of tool helps which objectives. But we've also done 26 interviews within 5 universities, interviews with lecturers of a blended course. And what we see is their tool use is very, let's say, basic. The great majority does not use advanced tools. One thing I'd like to point out is several interviewees mentioned that they experimented with tools like wikis, blogs, journals, even online forums, and most of them said that students don't use them. Students don't like to use them. One interviewee said, and would you believe, students, they still keep on emailing me. So when they want feedback, when they have questions, I'm overwhelmed by a list of emails, despite the presence of those tools. So that's what we see in the field. Uh, Advanced tools not used very frequently, not always accepted by students. Uh, so it's what you do with technology, not the advanced degree of it. It's my it's.
Well, if I can pick up on the Stefan and Steve as well, to get back to two additional points which I think are important to make at at this stage. One has to do with the technologies, exactly. In this sense, Stefan was just mentioning that from the data that he is collecting or has collected in the project, that collaborative tools are not probably having the impact that we would expect. The experience from online universities is the opposite in a sense, and that I think it depends on the pedagogical model that is established by the institution itself, and so the pedagogical culture in the learning culture that actually is built in that community. So, for instance, from my own experience of Portuguese Open University, collaborative tools are actually working. And collaborative tools, including wikis, for instance, which are an important part of the learning path. So, but maybe there is also here some kind of difference between institutions regarding the learning cultures that they actually represent, in a sense, or their communities built. However, it is clear that we should be taking a more more focus on the introduction of artificial intelligence elements, also learning analytics. This has been, well, some gamification elements as well. This has proven to be probably even more interesting for students which are not which do not operate, which are not actually part of a fully virtual learning community in a sense, or which don't share that kind of learning culture. So this is something that could be taken into consideration, because in fact there is here a trend towards a more autonomous learning approach. Well, and personalization in a sense can also be leading us into that direction. This is a difficult discussion because we can of course trace different kinds of developments. One which is basically consolidating the collaborative approach, even going a step further in a connectivist approach, which is not a collaborative approach. There is differences. We don't have time now to explore them, but anyway, it's a different kind of scenario. But the personalization element seems to be much more closer to the expectations of the, well, conventional university students, which adopt a blended learning approach. A final point, which I think it's important, has to do with assessment and certification. And this is probably the area in which a larger revolution is going to happen, or is already happening. And we must take that into close monitoring, in a sense. So blended learning now is, in the 21st century approach, is very much linked also with the transformation of how assessment and certification is conducted. And this connects also with what Steve was saying about the expectations of the 21st century learners. And it has also a lot to do with the experience that we got from the results that we got from the experience of the MOOC phenomenon. So I would also point that out.
I would think it's interesting, Steve, if you can also give answer to John Roswell in the chat. I mean, loud. I mean, you can, because I think it's a good point to discuss about this thing about if learners should be taking, you know, the power, developing their own path of learning.
Yeah, well, I have answered him twice in the text, but I will elaborate on that if anyone wants me. I think the question is whose responsibility is it to choose the pathways? I still maintain it's the student's responsibility to choose the pathway they prefer, but that means that the provider, in other words, the university or the course designer, whoever you want to talk about, they have to provide options, they have to provide choices. And this could be multiple pathways. So, for instance, a student might wish to study completely face-to-face, or they might wish to study completely away from the university, or they might wish for Antonio's hybrid version of that. And even within online or face-to-face, there can be options. So in online, for instance, they could choose to study synchronously or asynchronously, on their own or in a small group, student-led or teacher-led. There are so many options open. But I think the crafty, the clever designer must create multiple pathways. Or be open to other options as students request them. So I think that is my answer. I think it's the responsibility of both the provider and the learner to kind of design between them the best pathways for them to achieve their learning outcomes.
Well,
Yeah,
if
and
I may, Angelis, just to complement a
yes.
bit what Steve was saying, I think this is one of the clear trends that we must be following, which is the increased participation of the learners in the design or the co-design of their learning experiences. Not just choosing pathways, but the participation in the design of the learning experience itself. And of course, this has to do also with the introduction of peer-focused elements in terms of assessing and all as well. So peer assessment in that sense as well.
Yeah, and I'll also have one question to you. Antonio, is the role of face-to-face now in the future of open and distance learning institutions? What do you think about it?
There was for many years this claim that in the future, mostly there will not be a division between conventional universities and distance learning universities, but all of them will be hybrid in a sense. Well, I'm not exactly following that line. I was never in agreement, but I would say that they will be becoming more, in a sense, more similar in many ways, but they will not be the same. And the difference here, I would say, would remain on the focus of their learning culture. What is the basis of their learning culture, which I think it's different. However, getting back to future of universities in general, I would say that they will clearly become blended learning institutions in this broader sense, right? So digital learning is now mainstream, and so this is part of the everyday routine in a sense of any university these days. They cannot miss it, and if any, the one of the consequences of the MOOC phenomenon has been that one, to actually mainstream digital education across at least the higher education system, but not just the higher education system. We could also look at the other sectors, because the same phenomenon is happening as well.
So would you agree to? Yeah, sorry, Steve. Go on.
I would like to add something to when we're talking about technologies. Maybe there's a difference between technologies to design a course, let's say a flexible course, which is called adaptive blended learning, and also with the use of learning analytics, but also questioning students. So in that sense, I agree that more adaptivity, more flexibility, more choices in learning paths, that is for me also the future. I'm currently starting a research project on adaptive blended learning. But when I talked to those lecturers, I think they were mentioning the use of tools for students, like hey, students, use a wiki. Can you please keep a journal online? Can you use a blog? And those types of tools, they are not always successful from the point of view of the student. But that's different from designing an adaptive system using learning analytics. So those technology, I'm in favor of course.
Yeah, there are design issues around delivery tools against implementation tools. The two are slightly different, aren't they? And I think students tend to use the tools that they want to use rather than tools that the university necessarily supplies for them. So they'll go to the learning management system when they have to get something, but they'll go to Facebook or to Twitter or somewhere else Instagram when they want to, because that's where their friends are. I think all of this is contingent on one really important factor, and we haven't really mentioned it. I think Antonio alluded to it earlier on, but we haven't really mentioned it yet, and that is that you can lead a horse to water, but you can't make it drink. In other words, you can provide as much technology as you want into any university, and all universities are doing this now. They're all saying, yeah, we're going to adopt the blended learning approach, we're going to bring in lecture capture, and we're going to bring in, everything else. But what about the academics themselves who refuse or to use it, or maybe don't want to use it because they're worried about using it because it will take away something about their teaching methods, or they don't want to learn new ideas? There are always going to be resistances to these technologies, and there's also going to be the skills gap, or the literacies gap, I think, which Antonio mentioned, the digital literacies gap. I think we cannot assume that students know how to use these technologies even though they're younger. There's no such thing as the digital native. That's a myth. Everyone struggles to use technology, some better than others. But I think that across the board, whether it's lecturers, teachers, or students themselves, everyone needs to be aware and to start acquiring the new digital literacies. I'm thinking, for instance, of transliteracy, which is the ability to be able to convey your ideas and communicate effectively over many different media. So what we're doing now, for instance, with a webinar, we've got video, we've got audio, we've got text. Those are three separate modes. Can we use each of them equally well to convey our ideas? And you have to kind of think then about multitasking. You have to start thinking about dividing your mind up. But they go beyond skills because they are adaptable, and they adapt to any environment that we find ourselves in, even if it's unfamiliar. So I think we have to start pushing the idea more about not just using the technologies as they are, but using them effectively, and using them for more than just substituting old practice for new practice. I point you to maybe the SAMR model, which is by Ruben Pentadura, which gives you 4 levels of adoption of technology. And each one, the higher ones you go up, the more you're changing your practice radically in terms of the technology affordances. So you start off with substitution, and it may be an interactive whiteboard. You use it just to write on and to project onto, just like you would with a normal whiteboard. But there are so many more things that you can do with that interactive whiteboard. So you move up through SAMR all the way up to the top to kind of defining what you're doing as a teacher. And I think that is where we need to head for next.
Well, if I may just to complement a little bit on what you were both saying, I would also make 2 additional points. First of all, when Steve was talking about the resistance in academics or in faculty, it has to do also with loss of control. So this is something which is cultural. So faculty, well, teacher staff have to learn to lose control or lose the full control of the process, and to share that control as well. On the other hand, institutions have also to embed this notion of learning and unlearning, and this continuous rebuilding process of which is also a cultural notion that we still don't have in our institutions. We still have this traditional notion that there is a continuous building and there is an accumulation of learning, and this is not the case, as we know. Getting back to another point which was made, I would give, for instance, if someone in the chat was referring to the bring your own device technology. We have a lot to learn, for instance, with what happened with museum institutions regarding their educational approach. Very rapidly, they've adopted technology, but they change their own, in the sense, operational culture, their organizational culture. And for instance, they have to redesign their systems, opening them up, allowing to the visitors to take a larger role, so to participate much wider and much stronger, much more effectively in the construction of the exhibition, of their experience, as well as museum visitors. So we have to also to look at other institutions who have come across this challenge of introducing technology and learning from them how they've done it. And so in this sense, blended learning in the 21st century also has to do with this approach of bringing your own device, so letting the students to choose their own technology, as Steve was mentioning as well. And this represents a lot of challenges for the institutions. For instance, defining what is their space, what is their, even from an ethical point of view, what is their responsibility. Because one important thing is that participants, students having a large participation in the process also represents that they have a larger responsibility in their learning process as well. But they cannot be left alone. So they should not be taking the full responsibility. It has to be shared between the institution, the teacher, the teachers, and also the learners in this sense.
Okay, let's move to the other next two questions. So, innovative practices, or what would you consider something that is interesting? Is there any experience with blended learning that you have enjoyed and considered most valuable, or any development that you would like to mention as a successful one, in your opinion? And well, let's go with this first fifth question, and then we'll move to the sixth one.
I used to manage a module, which was a research module for my third year undergraduates, and they were coming to the point where they were just to qualify, and they had one final task to do, and that was their research dissertation, which is quite a large piece of work, maybe 10,000 words, you know, and they had to select and then implement a project based on a research question that was based upon their practice in the schools that they were teaching in. And I set up a group blog for them. I thought about using a wiki, but then I thought, well, no, actually a group blog is probably better, because it allows each of them to create their own little spaces within it, but then to also read each other's work and comment on it. And that's exactly what they used to do. So each of them would give a regular update. They'd present, you know, they'd write every week about how far they'd got with their research project. And then we'd come back into the classroom every week for one course. Then they'd go away and do all this work and research and gather the data and then interpret it. And all the way through that process, they were writing blogs, commenting on each other's work, saying, well, you did it this way, I did it this way. Or have you considered this? What about this piece of research by so-and-so? Have you thought about that, read this yet? And so all the way through, it was great comments and support. And the students basically supported themselves, with me just interacting every now and again when I needed to step in and intervene. So that for me was a really great blended approach. The students supported themselves in all three of those spheres that I mentioned earlier on, with me just occasionally having to step in. So it was very student-led, very much based on a digital social media tool, and very much about coming into the classroom to consolidate and going back outside and then applying that knowledge and that practice into the real world. And I think that was the very best for me of one of my best blended learning experiences in higher education.
We also had a very great experience with course on software engineering, which is actually my field of expertise. And so students have to create models from user requirements. You will find many a plethora of tools that you can use to let's say, draw those models, design those models. What we did, we developed a system that provided automated feedback to students. So we had to program this into an existing tool. And so students, when they drew a diagram, then the system would indicate where there are inconsistencies in the diagram. And the system would not only say, hey, these are the inconsistencies, but it would also visually depict where the mistakes are, which components were not designed right. And we did some experiments with it in several groups of students over 3 years. And using that automated feedback tool gave spectacular results, actually. And so now we are using it more and more. The only drawback is that it was an enormous effort to design such a feedback tool. And of course, what we also don't know is the long-term effects. So we saw an increase in exam scores. Students were satisfied. But in this area of automated enabled feedback in software engineering, this is something very, very promising. Let's say we are elaborating on this in the future. Just one example.
Well, I can share also an interesting experience, which actually comes from well, different kind of institution, because it's from the Open University. It's a fully online university, so it's a blended learning approach from a different kind of university. Well, we have a master degree on art education, in which most of the learning process is conducted online, well, in a very intensive collaborative, using a very intensive and collaborative approach. I won't get into details because you can understand more or less how it's organized. And the blended approach is built upon the addition of a particular week in which there is a kind of practical workshop in which all the students who have been interacting online and learning online, actually in this week they gather in this place, usually in the town in the country, the countryside, and with the help of the local authorities, they organize a series of performances in the town, delivering shows to the population, engaging in debates, and so on and so on. And so this is an interesting experience in which we reach for this hybrid experience that I was referring at first. So there is this online component of the process, which is fully online, but at the same time there is this element of physicality, in the sense that is also linked with an important part of the learning outcomes, in a sense, which are linked, for instance, with the use of the body and all of these, which is typical of that particular community. So it's an interest, and at the same time, it also links with something Steve was also mentioning, which is the outreach to the community. This notion that the learning process is also embedded in a social experience which is relevant and leads to some kind of results and impact. Well, this is an additional case that I would like to share.
Okay, and what did you think about the opportunity of well, exploring blended learning in the international domain now that we will have this European university, making use of a local approach, local proposals?
I don't know what that means. What does local mean? I know that people like
global. It's a combination of global and local. So global by online and local and face to face.
I know it's a confection, and I know that people, in the past have used this expression. It's been around for about 20 years. I think that I'm trying to remember the name of the woman who Dana Boyd first used it. I think back about 20 years ago. But I'm not sure what that means in terms of what we're talking about here. Does it mean policy? Are you talking about policy? Or are you talking about funding? What are you talking about?
I was thinking about things like, for example, MOOCs that are delivered by online means. I mean, in a local and global, sorry, global perspective. But then in a local, there are local approach to give support, for instance, for the students that are doing or doing practices of this MOOC in a local way. I mean,
Well,
face-to-face way.
yeah, well, Angeles, just to start the round, the example that I gave was, in a sense, an representative of this possibility. Well, you have an online course which actually has an international cohort. We have students in that program from Brazil, from Africa, from Portugal, from other countries, and when they meet in a specific place. And of course it has impact in that place, in that community, at the regional level, or local level in that case. Well, we have a new friend, a very important one, a very important participant in this discussion as well. Well, but getting to this question again, Angelis, this will, well, I believe that you're trying to refer also to this new scenario of consortium and a partnership between online universities and conventional universities, or conventional universities which also use all these kind of online education initiatives as MOOCs or others. I believe that yes, we don't know exactly what will be this leading into, but anyway, it is clear that this partnership, this consortium, this working together will increase, and it will have impact both at the global level and possibly also local levels as well. How exactly that is going to happen? I believe it will depend on a lot of variables, and it will probably lead to very different kinds of experiences that we're now not foreseeing clearly. And this is something that sometimes we have to take into consideration. In many ways, for instance, if you look at the MOOC movement, it was not expected at first, and what it led to was not expected as well in the middle of the process. So sometimes these phenomena have impact, they are important, they are significant, but they are not necessarily leading to what we are expecting. But in this sense, I would say yes. I think that this is a trend that will clearly dominate in the next few years, but not exactly how or to what it will be conducting. I'm not exactly sure at this point.
I was thinking about I don't know if you know Otto Scharmer, You Laugh. Yeah, I think this is a very innovative experience in this perspective. I mean, they have this global MOOC with many thousands of students working on social transformation, but then people work together in local projects that they are developing, grounding the projects in their near environment. So I think that could be a very powerful way of transforming things and putting together what is a global and international perspective with people from everywhere, but then just working together with people in your city or in your country for this development of projects, of new projects. So that's why I was thinking about this perspective, for instance, of Otto Scharmer in his EU Lab.
Yes, sorry, Steve, just to say, yes, I agree with you, Angelis. And this is already happening. So we have combinations which are really interesting from a perspective of increasing globalization of higher education, using online learning, of course, but on the other hand, having local impacts as well. Steve, back to you.
Thank you for all of that, Antonio, for elaborating on that. I think the important thing is that the cross-cultural, the mix between everything, not just the face-to-face and remote and the technology combinations, but also I suppose the cultural mix is really important. Now, this is Pippa. She's a blend. She's a mix between two different breeds. She's a hybrid animal, a cross as they call them. So she's a mix between a Cavalier King Charles Spaniel, which has a stubborn streak in it, and also a Bichon Frise, which is, I think, a Maltese dog. So, and I know from talking to the breeders that actually thoroughbreds are not as strong as the mixes. The mixes bring together lots of different qualities from different breeds. So this is a stronger dog, if you like, and probably more stubborn in some ways than a normal Bichon Frise would be. I think it's important that we mix our cultures together, that we learn from each other across all the different cultures, across all of society, at all levels, and in that way, we're all going to learn much more from each other.
I also would think that as a lecturer myself, I can take advantage of courses via as a MOOC, via edX, Coursera. So I learned a lot from international, well-reputed universities. For instance, I teach a data mining course, and then I go and see how do the other university do this, how do they approach this, what tools do they use. So I can learn a lot from it myself as a lecturer.
Yes, and on the other hand, of course, blended learning it has the potential to increase and to make it much more popular in a sense, much more mainstream, the internationalization of higher education, and in that sense, of course, contributing to these cross impact. So having a global outreach, but on the other hand, having also local impact. But this is also, well, for instance, in Europe, I'm really happy to learn that the expected development of the Erasmus program, for instance, for student exchange, will be including already in the next phase virtual mobility. These will be very important also to support these kind of experiences.
So we move towards our last two questions. And well, you have already mentioned about quality assurance. So, and you have mentioned this kind of things also in your talks and in your answers. So are institutions really prepared for innovative blended learning proposals? And what would be the main difficulties in this transition? How to translate good practices to other universities as the Empower, for instance, is doing, and how to organize change management? That would be the first question. And if you want to link with the eighth one, would be what effects should have a progressive implementation of blended learning models on the quality assurance systems of universities and quality agencies. So it's this combination of if we are prepared, how we can be prepared, and what does it mean in terms of quality, and how to prepare for that.
I think that all institutions are prepared, because all leaders within universities see the very important need to provide digital solutions. When I'm looking at a digital age workforce that is on the move, mobile and flexible and agile, and wants to learn when they want to, and how they want to, and where they want to. But I think, as I said before, I'm not sure that all academics are ready for this, and there will always be resistance to change. I've just written a new book on that very subject, which came out in April, and the first two chapters deal with the subject of change agency. What is it that we can do in large organizations like universities that will implement change across the board and make it successful? Well, the only way I can think of is to find opinion leaders, people who are champions of the ideas that other people will listen to, and get them to try the new techniques, or to promote the new techniques first, so that others can see the results of that and then think, oh, okay, I could do the same. I think Everett Rogers talked about this back in the 50s, the idea that opinion leaders, they are the innovators from which others will sit up and take notice. I know that in my own institution, because I was a fairly senior member of staff, I would break the rules. I'd occasionally break the rules or subvert the rules and do things which, maybe the managers didn't want me to do, but to show that it could work. So, for instance, I was the first person to create a completely non-paper-based course within my face-to-face university sessions. So there was not a single piece of paper that changed hands. And when it came for the students to submit their assignments, the admin were asking, we need paper-based copies of this. And I said, why? Well, we need to print them out so that the examiner can actually take them away and read them. And so I said, well, they're not going to do that because this is a digital program. We've done away with paper completely. And they insisted on paper. So I said, okay, give me the phone. And I picked up the phone and I spoke to the external examiner and said to him, are you happy with this? He said, perfect, what a great idea. And they ran out of ideas, so they had to let me do it. And now everything at the university now is virtually paperless. So you have to sometimes break the rules and take courage, I think, and just stand up for what you believe in and try and make a difference that way. And then other people will believe it and see the success of it and also do the same thing. That was my solution anyway.
Well, as you know, my experience is a little bit different from Steve in the sense that I was responsible for leading, well, a top-down institutional strategy program to change the entire learning model. So in this sense, change from a paper-based university to a fully online one. I still, well, from my experience and also drawing back from all the many experiences that I've learned throughout the years in other institutions, I believe that the best approach is to have a combination of a top-down with a grassroots approach. You need, of course, to involve the community because you need to change their culture, and you cannot change the culture just because you issue some kind of statement or tell them to do so. It's a very difficult process and it takes time. On the other hand, if you don't have a clear aligned strategy from the institution leadership, starting from institutional leadership itself, you cannot achieve much. So the combination of the two, it's fundamental. It's a complex process. It involves all aspects of the university operation. Steve was just mentioning a couple of them. Of course, teacher training is fundamental, but I would start by the start in the sense. Of course, you have to define some kind of pedagogical approach that would be a reference tool for the entire institution. You have to train teachers. You have to train students themselves. Well, they are not prepared for this. Many of them have never learned online, so they used to use technology, but not for this. So we have to learn how to use it in this environment. Also have to learn. Well, as we were just discussing previously, digital literacy now, it does not mean just technical savviness. It's much more than that. It's understanding how to use information, how to select it, how to filter it, how to take decisions on the use of data, and so on. So apart from this, it also implies a change in the organizational structure of institutions. For instance, it doesn't make sense that, and we still are doing it, that we have, for instance, fully online universities that in the end have physical exams. I mean, it doesn't make sense. I mean, face-to-face exams. So it doesn't make sense, but it's still happening. So it's a kind of a holistic approach that will change the entire ecosystem, in the learning ecosystem at university. And as we know from the research that is being conducted, for instance, at the GISC in the UK, it's much more than that. Of course, this has also to take into consideration the environment of the students themselves, the community, all of this. It's not just the institution, it's how the institution is also involved in its ecosystem as well, its social ecosystem and cultural ecosystem. Regarding the institution, this is how I could summarize it, but the institution also needs that, for instance, the legal framework should be adjusted and adapted, that there is a new form of collaboration between institutions. Of course, it can be in the form of consortium, partnerships, and so on, but that's the way to collaborate. And we're now also facing a new challenge, which is, in a sense, the unbundling of the institutions themselves. So this will also have impact in the reorganization of the higher education as a system. And of course, institutions have to prepare for it. And this new reality will also empower, like the project's title, empower the community to collaborate or to work in a collaborative way, to innovate in a collaborative way, to teach in a collaborative way. I mean, it's not just a sole teacher. We have to think of teaching as a team effort as well. A collaborative approach that also includes the participation of the learners themselves. So it's a different environment that we're building in, and we have to prepare for it. So I would say, as Steve was saying, that they're prepared for it. I would say probably they are better prepared now than they were some years ago, but they're still probably not fully ready for this transformation, and we have to work on them, work with them in empowering them for this change. Regarding the last question, which is very important as well, and I know that Angeles, you want me to also say something about this. There has been a very important development from led by ENQA and also some of the quality assurance agencies in Europe, for instance, in Spain, the ACU Catalunya, and also other European associations, as FQAMI and others, which in the direction of adjusting the European standards and guidelines, which is the framework for quality assurance around the European area, higher education area, to adjust them to e-learning provision. And of course, this is very important to facilitate the dissemination of blended learning models across the system. This should also now be taken, this effort should be implemented by the national quality assurance agencies as well, or in some countries, as in Spain, by the regional quality assurance agencies as well. It's not possible for us to conduct this effort and at the same time to have quality assurance agencies which are basically hindering innovation, which are actually telling institutions, do not change. There is too much standardization, which is actually challenging the need for innovation. So we have to find a good balance between innovation and standardization, and this implies a good dialogue and a collaboration between the institutions and also the associations and organizations which represent digital education, the digital education community, as EADTU, as EDEN, and others, in this dialogue with the European institutions in order to evolve not just the legal framework, but also the quality assurance framework to one which actually facilitates the dissemination of blended learning models.
Well, I would like to add to this, to mention that within the in our embed project, this interplay between what we call micro, meso level, course, program, institution is very important, is essential. And in the 5 universities that we studied, we see a lot of effort on the institutional level related to technology-enhanced learning, also blended learning. What we also see, so this is the top-down approach, management, governance. What we also see when talking to those lecturers, that most of them that they were driven by their own personal interest. So that's a bottom-up approach, and so we're trying to find ways to match top-down and bottom-up to align them better. But one obstacle that was not mentioned, I think, is that when you're talking about the university level, institutional level, there are several sub-levels there. So you have the top level, and you also have the faculties typically. And at least in our university in Leuven, those faculties, they are almost semi-autonomous islands. And there's a lot of difference between those faculties. And so it's very hard for the top management to align them and to standardize policies and strategies related to technology enhanced learning. And so that I think that's a challenge in the future. How can we let's say, align bottom up and top down, but also how can we align on the top level the different faculties, programs, research institutes. I think that's the big challenge for the future.
And I would also ask you about how to prepare students for that. Do you think they are enough prepared?
Well, I can start. In my case, as you know, we have well, at the start of all the courses and programs at the University of Portugal, and this is something that it is in place since the day one from our digital transition. Students, it happened the same with faculty, but students had to engage in a module that will train them to not just use the digital learning environment, but also how to learn in a digital environment. So this is important for them to understand how they can actually experience to conduct the learning experience from a digital in a digital environment. And on the other hand, regarding teacher training, because it's also important to add, it is important that when we're talking about teacher training, we're not just talking about some lecture or some training course in a lecture hall about the use of technology. It doesn't have any kind of impact. What is important and what we do at our university is that all teacher staff, all faculty has, prior to become an online teacher, has to be an online student, an online learner, using the same environment, the same pedagogical model that they will be then implementing as teachers. It is important for them to understand the differences, to build their own approach to this different learning environment, to this learning culture as well, to understand what does represent for someone to be quiet and not saying nothing in the platform, to understand what is the importance of silence. I mean, silence in a classroom, it's not really significant. In an online environment, can be disastrous. So this is something that you can only understand when you experience it. And so also regarding teacher training models, they have to be immersive. They have to be actually aligned with the practice and not just some kind of lectures that can be delivered in a very standard mode.
We often talk about students as if they're a homogeneous mass, all the same. And we say the students will do this or the students will think that. Actually, there's so many diversities amongst the students, the age groups, 18 up to, I don't know, 90 plus, really, and lots of different socioeconomic backgrounds, and some have disabilities, maybe they have hearing impairment or vision loss. We have to treat each student as an individual, and I think the answer there is to maybe get students to do an inventory when they first arrive at the university or first enroll, and say, okay, what are the skills you have and what are the skills you want to have, and then here are the skills that we think you need as a third column, and maybe tick the box and say, yes, I want these skills, and then try and provide them with that support in the very first few days of their study, whether on campus or remotely. I think that back to the idea of digital literacies or digital readiness, I think in order to achieve competency in literacy, you have to learn the skills first and then apply them in different ways. So I think that we can't really answer the question, are students ready for this? We have to ask each student, are they ready? And then try not to make assumptions about what we think they know. And I think the other thing we need to remember as university people is that we need to manage expectations. Because when a student comes to university, they're expecting the model of education which they see on the television. Everyone sat in rows, everyone sat in the same place together studying. If they're enrolling on a distance course, they're expecting maybe a correspondence course like I did in the 90s with the Open University. I think it's up to us to educate them and to give them a reality check on what they can expect rather than what they think they're going to expect. And I think that way, I think then students will become much more able to adapt quickly to the environments they find themselves in, whether it's face-to-face, online, at a distance, hybrid models, using their mobile phones, whatever. I think that learning is learning is learning. It's just a matter of managing their expectations and getting them ready and getting them skilled up to the level where they can just about cope with anything when it changes and when it rapidly becomes different. That's my view anyway.
Okay, we're nearly in the end of the webinar, and I don't know if you want to express something else, or in the chat, for instance. I think we are struggling to give our students a good induction. Yeah, all the universities, I think we are struggling with that. But partly because there's wide variation. Yeah, Steve, what about diversity as a problem we have to face and to cope with?
I don't think it's a problem. I think it's a lovely challenge because, we've always been diverse, haven't we? There's never been a time when, in the history of humanity, when we haven't been diverse, when we haven't looked at different ways of expressing ourselves, different cultures, languages, ages, disabilities and abilities and so on. So I think it's a lovely challenge for us all to try and rise to. But back to that question about induction earlier on, one of the ways that we do that at Plymouth University is we often get in students who have either just qualified or who are in their final year, and we get them to buddy up with the younger students and take them around, show them where everything is, and spend a day or so with them just answering their questions about what can be expected. And I think that's often a great way. The students love doing it anyway because they like to show off what they know and express their knowledge and so on, and take the younger ones under their wing, or the newer ones under their wing. And I think that's often worked for us, and I'm sure other universities do a very similar thing. There's so much we can do to support diversity and to support the management of expectations. If we only think about it creatively and think about what resources we currently have available, it can be a very positive thing.
Well, if I may just compliment a little bit, diversity should not be taken as a kind of a new challenge in the sense that is something new that is happening. But we now have the tools and the ability and the experience and the expertise to tackle the diversity that there was always there, and we just could not tackle it because it was too complex. So the complexity, it's part of the problem, but it's a problem that we have to address and should address, and we are able to address now in a much better way. And of course, for these, the emergence of artificial intelligence, these new tools and these new technologies that are coming along can, of course, help us a lot. But this is the challenge that we should address independently of its complexity. Each student, each learner is unique, and we have to look at it as something of something that we cannot just avoid. It's something that we should tackle as something important, significant, and positive.
Yeah, John says, I should have said complexity. Yeah, we have a complex but challenging approach to that. So, we're just in the end. So let's come around. And I really want to thank you for accepting being with us this afternoon. Even your dog, Steve. So, Steve, I love that. I was saying that my cat always used to be with me when I was in a conference, and I missed him very much. And I would say that thank you also for sharing your expertise, your experience, for this lively exchange of ideas. I would say it's food for thought for all of us. And let's say we have to work for this culture of sharing things. I think this is our challenge. And well, thank you very much. I think it's been a pleasure to be the chair all these 3 days and to have you all here talking. And I hope all the participants too in the chat and on the webinars, may have found that this has been an interesting experience. And really thank you very much. And I hope to find you all in the near future in other webinars or wherever, or in conferences, or we will find ourselves also. Okay. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Angeles, for the great moderation. And thank you all.
Bye. Good afternoon.